What's the difference between a soldier and a cook? On December 16, 1944, the answer was nothing. Corporal James "Jimmy" Patterson had never fired a rifle in combat, never thrown a grenade, never charged an enemy position. He was a cook, 24 years old, assigned to a rear echelon supply depot 15 miles behind the front lines, responsible for feeding 800 men hot meals 3 times a day. His weapon was a ladle, not a rifle. His battlefield was a field kitchen with cast-iron stoves and 50-pound sacks of potatoes. But when Hitler's last desperate offensive, the Battle of the Bulge, smashed through American lines, German panzer grenadiers didn't care who was a soldier and who was a cook. They attacked the supply depot with machine guns, mortars, and orders to kill everyone. Jimmy Patterson was in the middle of making breakfast when the first mortar hit. And in the next 3 hours, this cook from Georgia, armed with nothing but a borrowed rifle and pure stubborn courage, would single-handedly stop a German advance and destroy a machine gun nest that was slaughtering his friends. If you want to know what happens when ordinary people are forced to do extraordinary things, subscribe now. This is the story of the cook who became a warrior. James Michael Patterson was born in rural Georgia in 1920, the youngest of 7 children in a family so poor that dinner was whatever they could grow, catch, or barter. His mother died when he was 8, and his father, a sharecropper who worked land he'd never own, couldn't cook to save his life. So Jimmy learned. Not from recipes or cookbooks, but from necessity. By age 10, he was feeding his entire family, turning scraps into stews, making biscuits from flour and lard, stretching 1 chicken into meals for 9 people. Cooking wasn't a hobby, it was survival. When Jimmy was 17, his older brother came home from a logging accident missing 3 fingers. Couldn't work anymore. The family needed money desperately. Jimmy dropped out of school and took a job at a local diner, cooking breakfast and lunch for 50 cents a day, plus leftovers he could take home. He was good at it. Really good. By 1940, Jimmy was head cook at the best restaurant in town, making more money than his father ever had. He had a future, a girl he wanted to marry, a life that made sense. Then Pearl Harbor happened. Jimmy enlisted in January 1942, not from patriotism, but from inevitability. Every man his age was going. At the induction center, they asked what skills he had. "I can cook," Jimmy said. The sergeant grinned. "Army always needs cooks. You'll never see combat, son. Safest job in the war." They sent Jimmy to quartermaster training, taught him to cook for hundreds using field stoves and canned rations, shipped him to England in 1943, then France after D-Day. He spent 18 months following the advancing American armies, setting up field kitchens, serving hot food to frontline troops who were grateful for anything that wasn't cold, K-rations. Jimmy never fired his rifle except during basic training qualification. Never saw a German soldier except as prisoners being marched to the rear. He wrote his girl back home every week, promising he was safe, that cooks don't fight. On December 15, 1944, Jimmy's unit set up a supply depot in Belgium, 15 miles behind the lines. The war was nearly over, everyone said. Germany was finished. Jimmy went to bed that night planning tomorrow's breakfast menu. Powdered eggs, bacon, coffee, biscuits. He woke up to the sound of German artillery destroying his world. The first mortar shell hit the supply tent at 05:30 hours. December 16, 1944. Jimmy was in the field kitchen, firing up the stoves for breakfast, when the explosion threw him across the room into a rack of pots and pans. His ears rang. Smoke filled the air. Through the canvas walls, he heard screaming machine gun fire, orders being shouted in German. German? That was impossible. The front line was 15 miles east. The Germans were retreating. Intelligence said, another explosion, closer. The kitchen tent collapsed, canvas and support poles crashing down. Jimmy crawled out from under the wreckage into chaos. The supply depot was under full assault. German panzer grenadiers, elite mechanized infantry, were pouring through the perimeter wire. MG-42 machine guns firing from the tree line, cutting down American soldiers who were stumbling out of tents half-dressed, confused, most without weapons. This was a rear area supply depot. 800 men, maybe 50 of them actual combat infantry assigned as security. The rest were clerks, mechanics, drivers, cooks, non-combatants who'd been told they'd never see action. Captain Morris, the depot commander, was rallying whoever he could find near the command tent. Grab weapons. Ammunition stored in Tent 7. Fall back to the warehouse. Move! Jimmy ran toward Tent 7 with dozens of others. A machine gun opened up, and men around him dropped, screaming. Jimmy dove behind a truck, heart hammering. He'd never been shot at before. Never understood how loud war was, how it smelled like burning and copper and terror. Someone threw him a rifle, an M1 Garand. "You know how to use this?" Sergeant shouted. "Basic training 3 years ago." "Then you're infantry now. Get to the warehouse." Jimmy ran, clutching the rifle, no idea if it was even loaded. Bullets snapped past his head. He dove through the warehouse door just as another mortar shell exploded behind him. Inside, 30 men, cooks, mechanics, one chaplain, crouched behind crates and boxes. Most had never fired a weapon in combat. Outside, the German attack was intensifying. Captain Morris pointed at a window. "They've got a machine gun nest in that farmhouse 200 yards out. It's cutting us to pieces. We need artillery support or air cover, but radio's dead." Jimmy looked out the window and saw the farmhouse, saw the MG-42 muzzle flash, saw his friends dying in the mud, and made a decision that would define the rest of his life. Jimmy studied the farmhouse through the shattered warehouse window. The machine gun nest was positioned perfectly, elevated second floor, clear fields of fire covering the entire depot. Every time someone tried to move, the MG-42 opened up, that distinctive ripping cloth sound that could fire 1-200 rounds per minute. Captain Morris was on the radio, trying to reach anyone. "All frequencies dead. They must have hit our communications first. We're cut off." The sergeant, a veteran named Foster who'd fought across France, assessed their situation grimly. "That gun has us pinned. We can't advance, can't retreat. They're bringing up more infantry. We've got maybe 20 minutes before we're overrun." Jimmy's mind was working differently than everyone else's. While they saw an impossible military problem, Jimmy saw something else. He saw the landscape the way he saw a kitchen. Understanding flow, timing, resources. "The ravine," Jimmy said suddenly. Everyone looked at him. "There's a drainage ravine that runs from behind those trucks to within 50 yards of that farmhouse. I've walked it a dozen times collecting water. It's deep enough to provide cover." Foster shook his head. "Even if you reach the house, that's a fortified position. You'd need explosives, a squad supporting fire." "I can cook," Jimmy interrupted. "I know about heat, pressure, timing. Grenades are just explosive recipes." He grabbed 4 grenades from an ammunition box. "Give me cover fire in 5 minutes. Captain Morris stared at him. "Patterson, you're a cook." "Was a cook, sir. Right now, I'm whatever you need me to be." "This is suicide." Jimmy thought about his girl back home, about the letter he'd written yesterday promising he was safe, about the 30 men in this warehouse who'd die if that machine gun kept firing. "Sir, I've spent 3 years feeding soldiers so they could fight. Maybe it's time I fought so they could live." Foster handed Jimmy his trench knife. "You'll need this if you get inside." "And Patterson? Don't cook too long. We can't hold more than 10 minutes. Jimmy checked his rifle, pocketed the grenades, and moved toward the warehouse's back door. Behind him, Foster whispered to Morris, "That cook's either the bravest man I've met or completely insane." Morris watched Jimmy disappear into the smoke. "Maybe both." The ravine was 3 feet deep and filled with freezing mud that hadn't seen sunlight in weeks. Jimmy dropped into it behind the burned-out trucks and started crawling, rifle slung across his back, grenades clipped to his belt. Behind him, the warehouse erupted with covering fire. Foster and the others shooting at the farmhouse, trying to suppress the machine gun, trying to give Jimmy a chance. The MG-42 responded immediately, bullets tearing through the warehouse walls. But the German gunners couldn't see the ravine from their angle. Couldn't see one Georgia cook crawling through frozen mud like a snake, moving toward them inch by agonizing inch, 50 yards. Jimmy's hands were numb, knees scraped raw through his pants. Mortar fire exploded somewhere behind him. The battle was intensifying, more Germans pushing through the depot perimeter. 30 yards. He could hear German voices now, shouting orders. Could smell cigarette smoke from the farmhouse. The machine gun fired in long bursts, methodical, professional, 20 yards. The ravine was getting shallow, offering less cover. Jimmy pressed himself flat against the frozen earth, barely breathing. If the Germans looked down, if anyone walked around the farmhouse for any reason, he was dead. 10 yards. The ravine ended. Between Jimmy and the farmhouse was 10 yards of open ground. A vegetable garden, frozen solid, no cover except one overturned cart. Jimmy checked his grenades. 4 M2 fragmentation grenades. Standard U.S. Army issue. He'd watched soldiers train with them, but had never thrown one in his life. Pull pin, release spoon, throw, take cover. Simple in theory, terrifying in practice. The machine gun fired another burst. Through a ground floor window, Jimmy could see movement. 2 German soldiers reloading, passing ammunition belts upstairs to the gunner. He had one chance. Sprint across the open ground, throw grenades through the window before they saw him. Hope the explosion took out enough of them that he could finish the rest. Jimmy pulled the first grenade from his belt, wrapped his hand around the spoon and whispered a prayer his mother had taught him as a child. Then he stood up and ran straight at the farmhouse, screaming. The Germans heard Jimmy before they saw him, boots pounding across frozen ground. A scream that was half war cry, half terror. They turned, raised rifles, but Jimmy was already pulling the pin on the first grenade. He threw it through the ground floor window like he was tossing a potato into a pot. Didn't wait to see if it landed. Pulled the second grenade, threw it through another window, then dove behind the overturned cart. The explosions came 1 second apart. Boom, boom. The farmhouse shook. Glass shattered. Someone inside screamed. Jimmy didn't think. Didn't hesitate. He charged through the smoke-filled doorway, rifle up, firing at movement. A German soldier staggered toward him and Jimmy shot him. Point blank. The first man he'd ever killed. No time to process it. Stairs ahead. The machine gun upstairs still firing. Jimmy climbed, stepping over bodies, ears ringing from the grenade blasts. Second floor. The MG-42 crew, 3 men, turned from their window position. The gunner reached for his sidearm. Jimmy threw his third grenade. It bounced off the wall, rolled under the machine gun, and Jimmy threw himself backward down the stairs as the explosion tore through the room above. Silence. The machine gun stopped firing. Jimmy climbed back up, rifle ready. The machine gun nest was destroyed. The crew dead or dying. The MG-42 itself bent and smoking. But he heard voices. German outside. More soldiers coming to reinforce the position. Jimmy grabbed the last grenade. Looked at the ammunition the Germans had been using. Belts of 7.92mm rounds. Useless for his rifle. He looked at the destroyed machine gun, the shattered windows, the tactical position that had been killing his friends. He could run. Get back to the warehouse. He'd completed his mission, but if he left, the Germans would just reoccupy this position, set up another gun, keep killing. So Jimmy Patterson, the cook from Georgia who'd never wanted to fight, made a decision. He pulled furniture, overturned tables, created a defensive position at the top of the stairs. And when the German reinforcements rushed the farmhouse, they found an American cook waiting for them with a rifle, a knife, and absolutely no intention of giving up the ground he'd just taken. Jimmy held the second floor of that farmhouse for 27 minutes. It felt like hours. The German reinforcements came in waves. First, 3 soldiers rushing up the stairs. Jimmy met them with rifle fire from behind overturned furniture, dropping 2 before they retreated. Then they tried grenades, lobbing them through the windows. Jimmy kicked one back down the stairs before it exploded, dove behind a stone chimney to avoid the second. His rifle ran out of ammunition. 8 rounds gone. Jimmy picked up a German Kar-98K from a dead soldier. Barely knew how to work the bolt action, but figured it out through pure necessity. They tried to burn him out. Someone threw a Molotov cocktail through a window. The wooden floor caught fire. Jimmy smothered it with a German greatcoat, choking on smoke, eyes streaming but refusing to leave. Why? He'd completed his mission, destroyed the machine gun nest. Could have retreated back to the warehouse. But Jimmy understood something in that moment that he'd never understood before. Sometimes stopping isn't enough. Sometimes you have to hold, because if you give ground, someone else has to take it back. And someone else might die doing it. So the cook from Georgia, who'd spent 3 years feeding soldiers, held that farmhouse like he was defending his mother's kitchen. Then he heard it. The most beautiful sound in the world, American voices, Sherman tanks, artillery fire walking across the German positions. Reinforcements had arrived. The 82nd Airborne, rerouted to plug the breakthrough, hitting the German advance from the flank. 20 minutes later, Captain Morris and Sergeant Foster found Jimmy sitting on the farmhouse stairs, covered in blood and smoke and plaster dust, the German rifle across his lap staring at nothing. "Patterson?" Morris couldn't believe what he was seeing. "You're alive." Jimmy looked up, eyes haunted. "The machine gun's destroyed, sir. They can't use this position anymore." Foster walked through the farmhouse counting bodies. 7 dead Germans. Grenade damage. Bullet holes everywhere. Signs of a sustained firefight. "One man did this," Foster whispered. "One cook?" "Not a cook anymore," Jimmy said quietly. They evacuated Jimmy to a field hospital 20 miles back. Physical wounds. Shrapnel in his shoulder, burns on his hands, minor bullet graze across his ribs. Psychological wounds. They didn't have words for those in 1944. They just called it battle fatigue and gave him 3 days rest. The Army awarded Jimmy the Silver Star. The citation read, "For gallantry in action against an enemy of the United States, Corporal Patterson, a non-combatant cook, voluntarily assaulted a fortified enemy position, destroyed a machine gun nest, and held the position against multiple counterattacks, enabling friendly forces to reorganize and counterattack successfully. But Jimmy never went back to being a cook. Command reassigned him to an infantry company, gave him a rifle and said, 'You've proven yourself. Welcome to the war.' Jimmy fought through Belgium, across the Rhine, into Germany. He survived the war, came home in June 1945, and never cooked professionally again. Couldn't. Every time he stood in front of a stove, he was back in that kitchen when the mortars hit, back in that moment when everything changed. He took a job as a factory foreman, married his girl, had 3 kids, lived a quiet life in Georgia, never talking about the war except to say, 'I served. Did my part.' In 1984, 40 years after the Battle of the Bulge, the Army conducted interviews with survivors for a historical project. Sergeant Foster, now 83 years old, living in Florida, told the story of the cook who'd saved the supply depot. "I've seen Medal of Honor recipients who didn't show half the courage that Jimmy Patterson showed that day," Foster said. "He wasn't trained for combat, wasn't prepared, wasn't supposed to fight. But when the moment came, he did what needed doing. That's what heroism is, not absence of fear, but doing the right thing despite being terrified." The interviewer asked if Jimmy had ever talked about what happened in the farmhouse. Foster shook his head. "Once, I asked him years after the war how he found the courage to charge that machine gun nest. You know what he said? 'I didn't think about courage. I thought about the boys in that warehouse. They were hungry, scared, depending on me to feed them. I'd been feeding them for 3 years. Couldn't let them die just because I was afraid.'" James Patterson died in 1994, age 74, in the same Georgia town where he'd been born. His obituary mentioned his Silver Star but didn't explain the details. Most people in town knew him as the quiet factory foreman who'd served in the war. Nothing special, but at his funeral something extraordinary happened. 3 men in their 70s flew in from across the country, survivors from that supply depot. Men who'd been in the warehouse when Jimmy charged the farmhouse. Men who'd lived 70 years because a cook had decided to fight. They stood at Jimmy's grave and told his children a story they'd never fully heard. About the morning their father stopped being a cook and became the man who saved them all. One of them, a former mechanic named Roberts, said, "Your father used to say his job was feeding soldiers. But on December 16, 1944, he fed us something more important than food. He fed us hope. He showed us that it doesn't matter what your job is or what you were trained for. What matters is what you do when everything falls apart." Jimmy's daughter asked the question that had haunted her for years. Did the war change him? Roberts nodded slowly. "The war changes everyone. But your father, he didn't let it break him. He just carried it. Carried all of us who lived because of what he did. And he never complained, never asked for recognition. Just went home and lived his life like it was the most natural